Hi, my name is Julie Beeling-Hovdahl, and I'm the author of the recently released book, Beneath Sheep's Clothing, The Communist Takeover of Culture in the USSR and Parallels in Today's America. And I am recording this video to give some background information on, well, there's something that we see, a lot of us see in our society, in our schools, called wokeness and wokeness, to be more clear. And what is wokeness about? And I'm going to prove in this video, and I'll give you resources to verify that wokeness is actually a form of Marxist ideology. And I'm going to prove that to you in this video. Let me just tell you a little bit about myself. In the late 90s, I was a missionary in Russia for a year and a half. And then I came back from Russia and I attended graduate school at Florida State University. And I got a dual master's in Russian language and literature and Russian and East European studies. And I wrote my master's thesis on underground Christian movements in the Soviet Union, their survival tactics and the tactics of the Soviet government to stamp them out. So I spent 2 years working on my thesis, exactly 20 years ago, actually. And I actually have all my materials actually in my office right across from me. 2 big boxes of materials that I was delving into primary sources and all kinds of materials on the oppression of Christians in the Soviet Union. So I became intimately aware of the tactics of communism, especially in regards to taking over a culture, taking over Christianity, and trying to destroy Christianity. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I wrote my thesis and then defended it in 2004. And then I began seeing some disturbing things in our society. In about 2008, 2009, I began observing some of the same tactics that I wrote about in my thesis. I started to see them happening in America. And so I became curious. And that is when I actually wrote the bulk of my book. And then I couldn't quite finish it. I set it aside and I just finished writing it in March of 2022. So I'm recording this video specifically for anyone. I live in Southern Utah, in Washington County, Utah. And I am especially recording this for educators, school board members, and school administrators in Washington County, but also our state legislature here in Utah, and honestly anywhere in the country, because these same trends are occurring nationwide. And like I said, I'm going to prove to you that wokeness that we are seeing is Marxist in origin. So before I delve into that, I just kind of want us to imagine what our world would be like if none of us had studied the Holocaust when we were in school. When I was in school, I read the diary of Anne Frank, as I'm sure everyone else did. I've watched many different documentaries and movies about the Holocaust. I've been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. It's utterly horrifying. And I have a very deep, visceral feeling about what happened during the Holocaust. And I think most people can relate to that. So when we hear about threats of Nazism and anything like that, or if we hear of something that sounds like somewhat like the Holocaust, most of us are like really like, no, I don't want anything to do with that. Nope, we're not doing that. So that's how it should be. The problem that we have is that we have not been educated in our society. We have not been educated about communism the same way we have been about Nazism and the Holocaust. That's a huge problem. It's a huge, huge problem. And the only reason that I have been educated more is because of the background that I already shared with you. Otherwise, I would be in the same boat. So I'm just really feel strongly because I've had that visceral reaction the same way that any of us seeing anything like the Holocaust would be like, that's how I feel when I see the same Marxist communist patterns. It really makes me very uneasy, and especially seeing how well it's covered up Um, my book is entitled Beneath Sheep's Clothing. The wolf in sheep's clothing is a very good metaphor for Marxists, because they absolutely cloak themselves in things that are seemingly benign, not only benign, but actually good and helpful. So what is communism? So before we define communism, let's define socialism. And socialism is a system characterized by government ownership and control of major industries. And then oftentimes in socialism, the people receive different handouts, different benefits, usually have very high taxes. And the people don't own, their own land, they don't own their own businesses in pure socialism. Communism is actually the enactment, the implementation of socialism through force, through violent means. And when we talk about Marxism, we're talking about the form of communism that Karl Marx discussed in his book, The Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx was a German philosopher in the 1800s, and he basically outlined the basis for the communist playbook to be able to enact communism, to have that violent overthrow, that violent implementation of socialism. So, and this Marxist playbook is crucial to understand. It's actually quite simple. And what it is it's oppressed. You find an oppressed group of people. And unfortunately, looking through history, it's not hard to find oppressed groups of people, because it's one of the major themes of history is oppression of different groups of people. So you find an oppressed class or group of people, and you educate them about how oppressed they are. And oftentimes it's true, there's a lot of truth there, but you harp on that grievance to cause them to rise up against their oppressors, and you pick out what the oppressors are. In pure classical Marxism that Karl Marx discussed, the oppressed class was the proletariat, or the working class. In the working class, the people that were at the lowest end of the totem pole. And then the oppressors was the bourgeois, the people with money, the upper class. So when communism went into Russia, there was a huge, like 80+% of the population, over 80% of the population were peasants, and had started to become factory workers, some of them. And the Russian peasantry had only been freed from serfdom just a few decades earlier. And serfdom was not that entirely different from slavery. I mean, there's some differences, but there's also a lot of similarities. They're treated very poorly. They had very little. They had very few freedoms, if any. They were mostly illiterate. And if you look back in Russia, you look at that highly stratified society. You had the Tsar, the king. Tsar means king. The Tsar and his, associates, and the upper class and the landowners of the Russian Empire. On one hand, you have them, having their different balls and their different very ostentatious dress, and they're dining on fine foods, dining on caviar. They're attending theater, and they're living this high class life. Meanwhile, the vast populace, over 80% of the populace, are these peasants that are so poor that in the winter they're living in their little huts with their livestock. It's freezing cold, and they share the same space with their livestock. Sorry about that. So you see there's a huge difference in the way of living between the peasants and the upper class. And so that was pretty much a ripe society for the picking, for communism to be tested out. In addition, Russia was just beginning to become industrialized at the beginning of the 20th century. So it wasn't that difficult within Russia to be able to find a lot of discontented peasants and to teach them, you are so oppressed, which they were, and we need to rise up against the Tsar and the Russian Orthodox Church and the bourgeois and tear them down. and have a violent overthrow of this society. And then we're going to set up a socialist communist paradise where everyone is going to have bread and land, everyone is going to be treated equally, and there's going to be no more oppression, and et cetera, the beautiful fairy tales that the communists like to tell. So, but really and truly, there's never been a communist society where that has worked out. What we've ended up with is more impoverishment, enslavement, and death being the major fruits of communism. So when we talk about the Holocaust, obviously the people put to death, the Jews and other classes of people, groups of people put to death in the horrific system of the death camps and the concentration camps. It's horrific. The estimates are 6 million Jews were put to death in the Holocaust, plus a few millions of some other groups of people. So this is my scale. And I'm sorry, I'm like super low tech. I really want to get this video out today. I don't have time to like do like cool graphics and editing and stuff like that. So I'm just doing like really basic stuff here. Under communism, in Russia alone, the former Soviet Union alone, I should say, the estimate is upwards of 61 million deaths that the Soviet Union put to death of its own people. And we're not talking about wartime deaths. We're not talking about people who died during the Bolshevik Revolution or Civil War. We're talking about people that died either due to famines from mismanagement of resources, or people who were executed or perished in the concentration camps in the Soviet Union, which no one ever seems to even know anything about. The Gulag. The Gulag was not a system of death camps like the Holocaust. They were labor camps, but they might as well have been death camps because that was the end result for many of the people who went to the Gulag. So this is the Soviet deaths from the Soviet Union of its own people, not during wartime. And then if we add China into the mix, then we're gonna go, that's another 80 million or so. And then there's the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the killing fields. We don't even know about North Korea. We don't have any numbers from there. There's Cuba. There's different, Vietnam. There's different nations through Asia, Africa. By 1985, 1/3 of the world's population was living under a communist regime. The whole Eastern Bloc of Europe, again, parts of Latin America, Cuba, parts of Asia. And this is, the death toll continues with communism versus the Holocaust, which was, again, Holocaust is horrific. But why aren't we learning? Why didn't we learn about communism? There's a reason for that I won't get into right now. It's not a very good reason. It's a pretty nefarious reason, actually. So when I talk about communism and how it's bad, that's why. It's because of the death toll. So this is one line I'm going to read from my book. I'm not going to do that very much, but this is my first sentence of my introduction. When communism comes knocking at the door of a society, it doesn't say, hey, I'm here to impoverish, enslave, and murder you. Instead, it cloaks itself as a savior and says, I'm here to liberate you from oppression. So that's what the communist playbook does, is it poses itself as, we're going to save you from oppression. So let's go through, let me share actually just a little bit more about communism. So some other features besides impoverishment, enslavement, and death. Another major feature is propaganda and brainwashing of the people. In my book, I focus on how, specifically how communism deals with education and with the churches, with Christianity, which Christians are one of the top enemies of communists, Marxists. They just cannot deal with Christians and Christianity. So we know that when the Bolsheviks, well, it was actually before the Bolsheviks took over, but the Tsar of Russia and his family were killed or executed. Russian Orthodox churches were demolished. Orthodox priests and monks and nuns were arrested, executed, I mean, tortured, really horrible things happened. And Russian Orthodox Church was a very, very big part of the culture. It was actually the unifying glue of the culture of the Russian Empire. We have a lot of propaganda posters well, I won't go into that. I could talk forever. Just a few examples. These are some new Soviet workers dumping Jesus on his head and the emblems of the sacrament, wine and bread out, dumping them out on the street out of a wheelbarrow. And this Soviet worker is taking a sledgehammer to a church bell. This particular magazine called Bezbozhnik means the godless. It was an anti-religious periodical. Some other examples of propaganda was a cult personality with the Soviet leader who became the new god, essentially. The state was the new god, but the head of the state was a big part of that as well. Here it says, Lenin Zhil, Lenin Zhiv, Lenin Budit. Lenin lived, Lenin lives, Lenin will live on. So, you know, Lenin is eternal. We have children. This was a propaganda poster for children participating in the Young Pioneers. It was an organization, kind of like Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, but it was a communist propaganda, communist organization to get kids involved and to get them fully engaged in communism and scientific atheism, which was the official religion of the Soviet Union. Here's a nice little propaganda poster where it shows Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. He was a Soviet citizen. It shows him flying in space and looking, and he didn't see God anywhere. Boga Nyet is what it says. There is no God. And so education was free. The Soviets educated their whole populace, and they brainwashed them in the process into scientific atheism, into a worship of the leader, a worship of the state. And yeah, there's a lot more on that. In the Soviet Union, those who spoke out and didn't go along with the status quo were at great risk of, well, depending on which era, but they were at great risk of, if they spoke out, they were at great risk for arrest, at different times execution, sometimes torture, imprisonment in the Gulag. The political prisoners in the Gulag were the bottom of the totem pole, treated the absolute worst. The rapists and the thieves and the murderers kind of ruled the roost in the Gulag. They were like the high class criminals. And the Christians and the human rights activists were the low totem pole people, low status in the Gulag. Yeah, famine. There was millions and millions, tens of millions of death in the Soviet Union from famine, from their experiments with agriculture and economics gone awry. So not a great place to be, not a great system to live under. Pretty horrific, especially if you are someone who enjoys free thought and free expression. It's not going to happen. So one more thing. When a communist nation first gets set up after they take power, one of the first things they do is they execute the dissidents. They execute also, not even just dissidents, people who don't agree with them, but people who are the intellectual class. Even if they agree, they get rid of all the potential people that could rise up and come at them and try to take their power away. They just work really hard to mobilize the masses to tear down the systems of power so they could come into power themselves. They're not about to let anyone else come in and take their power away. So in the Soviet Union, that was kulaks, or peasants who had maybe they had 2 cows instead of 1. They were a little too wealthy and didn't want to give up all of their cows and their farmland to the government. They could be executed or taken to the Gulag. They were very frequently. I already said Christians, but artists, musicians, poets, people who were very influential were very often at the receiving end of this treatment. Even scientists, and just the intellectual class. So yeah, that's a little bit about communist history. I hope you can see why I am completely opposed to it and why anyone with half a brain would be and should be. And I hope you can see why I have a very personally, very visceral, after studying communism in depth, and not only that, living in Russia and seeing the aftermath of a communist society, and seeing the trauma. I met so many traumatized people when I was there, uh, traumatized by their own government and their system. And I have just a very strong reaction and a very strong desire to educate people um, in our country. And I hope there's time for us to turn the tide. So, one thing about the Marxist playbook is that it adapts itself to different circumstances. I'm going to talk about wokeness. I'm going to talk about, this is the plant of wokeness, and it's got little, I taught this presentation part of it a week ago, and I kind of likened it to like little goat heads that you kind of step on them and you're like, what is this? It's kind of an annoyance to people who have mainstream American values. Wokeness looks kind of strange and it's a little bit of an annoyance, but that's just seems like an annoyance. It doesn't seem like much more than that. But there are roots to this wokeness that go very deep. And that's what I want to talk about. I already talked about the first level of those roots, which is Marxism. Now we're going to go one level up to the cultural Marxists. Early in the 20th century, there were Marxists in Europe, outside of Russia, so Karl Marx had expected that people would just magically, that capitalist societies would just magically, automatically transform into socialist. And when that wasn't happening on a large scale, and all Western Europe and America were just really booming and moving forward with the capitalism, the Marxists in Europe started rethinking their positions. Let me pull out my other notes here. They had to try to account for the failure of Marxism to spread in the West, and what they came to, especially Antonio Gramsci was a communist in Italy, and he came up with some ideas, some pretty good ideas if you're coming from their perspective on how to make communism spread in the West. And what he described is that they had to go in and destroy, they had to go in and infiltrate. Okay, so in classical Marxism, the Marxists had to seize the means of production. They had to seize the factories and the farmland and take over those means of production and then oversee them. The cultural Marxists decided they needed to seize the means of cultural production of the West and infiltrate those means of cultural production in order to destroy the cultural hegemony, or this bulwark of beliefs and ideals in the West that were making it hard for communism to come in and make inroads. So what institutions are these that needed to be infiltrated? The church, family, education, law, entertainment, and media were the main parts of the cultural hegemony of the West that was making it hard. Their families are too strong. There's all these Christians that, they're not really, they have their own beliefs. They don't really want to go along with the communism. We have this legal system that's preventing us from breaking into these countries. And then the education, all these people are getting educated and they're not accepting communism. And then, so they're like, yeah, we've got to infiltrate. And so that's exactly what happened. And I actually go into this quite at length in my book, how this happened in America, of destroying the cultural hegemony. Entertainment and media, Hollywood was absolutely infiltrated by communists starting very early in the 20th century, like when Hollywood first started coming into prominence. This is documented, and as well as the churches, beginning from the early 20th century. By like halfway through, by the 1950s, half of America's mainline Christian churches were very fully infiltrated at top with leadership with communism. And it's only spread since then. the legal system infiltrated. That's a whole other topic, education. I have 2 chapters in my book that go into that. And yeah, so the cultural Marxists in the 20s. Then we go to the next level up. When Hitler came to power in Germany, a lot of the communists were in Germany. They Hitler didn't like them, and so the neo-Marxists, America brought them over and invited them. Oh, come on over to America. So we've got all these neo-Marxists in like the 30s and 40s, and the neo-Marxists came up with another way of spreading Marxism, and this is through critical theories. And critical theory was something that was brought into play. And now today we have critical race theory. So critical theory it's a fight for social justice, where justice is in opposition to freedom. In order to maximize justice, you have to minimize freedom. And justice for underprivileged groups, that sounds pretty good on the surface, but yeah. The problem with social justice is that it takes a big truth that there are groups of people who have been oppressed, and they marry that with the big lie of how that oppression should be dealt with, because the Marxists want to harness that discontent and poke at it and stoke that grievance to cause an uprising against the systems of power. So in the case of critical race theory, that was developed through time, but its roots were the neo-Marxists. Critical race theory, the oppressed class are people of color, and especially Black people, which obviously there is legitimate oppression that has occurred in America for sure. And then the oppressors, again, this is that Marxist playbook, oppressed versus oppressor. The oppressor is, they try to say it's not white people, but whiteness, white supremacy and whiteness. The problem is that anything that white people, any institution founded by white people, any ideologies founded by white people, that's a relic of whiteness. That is free game to be torn down. That's why we have people tearing down statues of founding fathers, why we have the Constitution. Even it was written by white men, so it's free game to be torn asunder. In the case of gender theory, the oppressed group, well, it gets a little bit more complicated here. So the oppressed group is people who are queer or non-binary or whatever, and then the oppressor is a cis normative society that has to be torn down. That means a society where men are men and attracted to women, and women are women. That system has to go, has to be torn down. Then we have queer theory, where again it's the heteronormative society is the oppressor, and the oppressed class are people who are any variety of queer, trans, gay, bisexual, whatever, that whole list. Now, it's true that there are people who fall into that category of being queer who have been oppressed or been treated improperly without proper respect. So, you can stoke up those grievances there. And one of the things that has happened with the critical theories in our schools, and this is what wokeness is. Again, wokeness is seeing everything through the lens of social justice. You see everything in society is through the lens of finding oppressed groups of people and the oppressors, and we got to go after the oppressors. We got to pick at and tear down those groups or those systems of power. So we have wokeness being promoted rampantly in our schools. And it's not just that they've gone after the people of color. It's not just that they've gone after LGBTQ teens and children. It's not just going for those groups. It's actually those groups, they've needed to get more people on board of this woke bandwagon, this woke Marxist, identity Marxist bandwagon. And they've done this, they're doing this now in our schools across the country in a variety of ways. I don't really know if I can go into those details here, but they are taking the children with privilege, if they get white kids, males, Christian, heterosexual, cisgender kids, and then making them feel guilty for their privilege, and then giving them a way out. Well, but you can redeem yourself from your sin of privilege by becoming woke and joining and becoming an anti-racist and becoming an activist, to help tear down these oppressive systems. So we're seeing whole slews of kids jumping on board this, feeling like they're doing good. They're helping their fellow man. That's how deceptive this is. And this woke Marxism has infiltrated many, if not most, of the major Christian churches. It is being taught literally in our schools right now to our children, unless we homeschool, or even then, there's tricky things going on with that. So what I want to talk about now is the 4 levels of communist enablers. And this is where it gets confusing. So out of the 4 major types of communist enablers in our country right now, only one of them is avowed communists, and that actually probably should be smaller. It should probably be much smaller. The vast majority of people promoting wokeism are not avowed communists. The next level down from the avowed communists are communist sympathizers. This would be like people who promote socialism. These are the communist sympathizers. They agree with a lot of the problems the communists discuss. They just don't agree with a violent overthrow of society. So we have our communist sympathizers down here. At the very top, well, I'll save that one for last. The most important group, well, they're all important. The most powerful group of these 4 are the dupes. And I'm sorry if that's offensive. I didn't come up with these terms. J. Edgar Hoover did. I did come up with this diagram. The big broad base of this foundation of this pyramid are people who are duped into social justice, the woke. They really truly think they're doing good. They don't want a violent overthrow of society. They don't want a communist system, but they are woke and they want to fight for social justice. They just don't understand who they're working for. And at the very top, the very tip top of the pyramid, we have the puppet masters money bags. I did come up with that. We have the people who are funding all of this woke incursion, all of this Marxist infiltration over a century. It began over a century ago in America. And just to give you an example, this is the likes of the Rockefeller family, Carnegie, the super wealthy, actually monopolistic capitalists. They're not communists themselves, but they're certainly happy to use this communist playbook to use it to control and subjugate the masses and make sure no one would take their power. So, and then I just realized as I was preparing this presentation, there's actually one more level of this pyramid that is crucial for them to continue to amass their power. And I'm going to just call them level 2 dupes. These are people who are not woke, but they're afraid of the woke. And they don't want to go against the woke. They don't want to be called, they don't want to be accused of being a racist, a bigot, a homophobe. They don't want the wrath of the woke coming against them. And so they will acquiesce to the demands of the woke. And in every society where communism is implemented, there's whole masses of people that are intimidated by the tactics and they just go along with it. They probably don't fully understand what's going on and they just are trying to get along. They want to be nice. They don't want to rock the boat. And the level 2 dupes. So in my personal opinion, the vast majority of people in Utah, or probably in every state, that are in our schools that are implementing the woke agenda would fall into the dupes and the level 2 dupes. Level 1, I have to call them level 1 dupes that are woke. And the level 2 dupes that just, they want to be nice and they want to be accommodating. The vast majority is being of the woke agenda, the Marxist identity Marxist agenda in our schools is being implemented by these groups. And so these are not people who are bad. These are not people with bad intentions. These are people with good intentions. So this is where we have to separate. We have to separate, oh, I know that so-and-so who's in charge, I know that they only have the best of intentions. Well, that could be perfectly true, but they could be a level 1 dupe or a level 2 dupe. And they're still a part of putting this Marxist agenda through. So some examples of, where did that go? Of the wokeness in our schools and that wokeness agenda, the identity Marxist agenda. We have pornographic books in our school libraries with graphic sex and graphic, adult male, little boy sexual encounters. Apparently there's a book in some schools in Utah that has a scene of an infant being raped. And somehow the top people, Attorney General of Utah is like, no, we can't take these books out of the school libraries. That's pure insanity. We have, the privilege exercises. We have 7th graders, taking notes in class where they're having to learn all about the multitude of different genders and all the spectrum of queerness at school. That's one thing if parents want to teach their children that, but that should not be part of the public education. That should be something that parents choose or not choose to implement. One of the ways that the woke agenda, the identity Marxist agenda, is propagated in our schools is through social and emotional learning, SEL. Some of the buzzwords that you are dead ringers for you're dealing with Marxism in a curricula, an SEL curricula, or anything else is diversity, equity, and inclusion. These words all sound good, but this is something that academic James Lindsay has some more information on. But diversity, when I think of diversity, I think of different people from different backgrounds sharing different opinions. I think that's great. But the Marxists, their definition of diversity is different. Their definition is you're not diverse unless you have the same opinion that they do. This is why people of color who are conservative are blackballed. Their opinion is not a diverse opinion. Only people of color who are woke are allowed to have their opinion, and they're diverse. It's insane. And then inclusion, that sounds good too. I'm all for everyone is welcome to the table, whatever your background, whatever your sexuality, whatever your race, religion, everyone is valuable and everyone has a voice. That's what I think inclusion means, but it's a different definition for the Marxists, probably more higher up the level of the avowed Marxists that are implementing, that have highly infiltrated all of the schools of education and academia at this point, way crazy beyond infiltrated. For them, inclusion means that people who express views that they don't agree with need to be censored. And these people sometimes need to be ousted from their positions because they have views that are not woke, not diverse, and are hurtful. Therefore, half or more of what I've been saying in this video would count to have me censored. I would for sure be censored and not allowed to speak in most university settings or academic type settings. So, and then equity is actually, that one is very easy to see that it's communist because it's not about equal opportunity, it's about equal outcome. Where, it's not okay for people to have different outcomes, it all has to be equal. We have an agenda right now. Our well-meaning school board, I'm assuming they're well-meaning in the state of Utah, are working with a group called Knowledge Works to implement this program that will do away with grades. And they're selling it under the guise of individualized education. And they use all these pretty words and it sounds good. But when you go to that website, the top quote on that website is from Ibram X. Kendi, who is one of the main critical race theorists, like activists that we have. And they're all about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, if you find those buzzwords, you know you're dealing with Marxists, with the Marxist agenda. Even if the people implementing it are really nice people, even if they're really well-meaning people, and they probably are. So what is the end goal here? This is what I'll end with. There was a man called Yuri Bezmenov, who was a KGB propagandist. KGB was the CIA of the Soviet Union. And he was a propagandist. His job was to go into other countries and to subvert those nations, to flip them to communism. And he defected from the Soviet Union in the late 70s and came to the West, and he was interviewed. The interview, you can find it on YouTube. He was interviewed in 1985, and he outlined the 4 steps to subverting a nation to communism. Step 1 is called demoralization. And it takes between 15 to 20 years minimum to demoralize a nation. And that is getting to the young rising generation and educating them in communism and getting them to accept it with open arms. In 1985, at the time of that interview, Bezmenov said that America was beyond sufficiently demoralized to communism. And at this point in 2022 is just so far beyond overfulfilled that it's crazy. Step 2 of subverting a nation to communism is destabilization. This takes, according to Bezmenov, it takes between 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation. This means destabilizing different infrastructure, food production, energy production, international relations, any number of ways with energy production to destabilize a nation. In my opinion, we've been in this phase since spring of 2020. So we've already had 2 years of destabilization. So it's cutting it close here because it only takes 2 to 5 years. The next step to subvert a nation to communism is crisis. This only takes 6 weeks. According to Bezmenov, the crisis is there's like some major like war or something where everything is just massive upheaval. And then step 4 is called normalization. But unfortunately, by step 4, the nation has already fallen to communism, and there's an indefinite period of normalizing the nation to communism. And what that looks like is execution of dissidents, the seizure of all the means of production, and communism has taken hold. Now, I don't know to what extent. So what it looks like, and this is what many people are saying, what is being implemented is not a purely communist system, but a communist fascist melding together, like kind of what they have in China. It's not pure communist anymore because they have, big business with the government, which is fascism. But you have a communist fascist melding, and then you also have this monopolistic capitalist element going into it. But the communist playbook to subvert and to weaken the people morally and to cause them to accept their enslavement and to take over a nation, that is totally at play. What it's going to look like if this whole process plays out, I don't think it's going to be good. I don't know if they're going to execute dissidents, but I don't want to wait to find out. Do you? So this is why it's so incredibly serious that as educators, as school board members, as school administrators, as legislators, that you take this very seriously. Okay, like this is not playing around. Just imagine that you are in Nazi Germany and Hitler was like, threatening to rise to power. He has spewing his rhetoric. And let's say there's someone who lived through something similar to that and they're trying to warn you. That's like me. And that's like a lot of other people who have lived under communist regimes that are extremely alarmed. They have been for actually a long time. I wrote most of my book over 10 years ago, and almost nobody would believe me. But things have gotten so much worse since then that now it's obvious if you're willing to look and open your eyes. I implore you, whatever power you have, whether you're a school librarian, a principal, a teacher, a school board member, a legislator, whatever you are, whatever power you have, to get the wokeness out of the schools, the woke Marxist agenda out of the schools. What very much looks like is happening is what was done in China, which is they had their cultural revolution and they raised up a red guard of young people to help overthrow society. And that's what it looks like is being prepared for here. And I do not want my child or your child or anyone else's child to be recruited to be part of this woke army, to think that they think they're doing good, because they've been brainwashed to think that the fight for social justice, which again, if you're helping the underprivileged, that is good. But when you've married it with this agenda to tear down whiteness, to tear down a heteronormative society where it's normal for men and women to be attracted to each other, that's fine. That there's some people that that's not how they are. I'm not going against that, but to make it normal, you can't. No, we're not doing that. And to radicalize these kids, to cause them to turn against their families of origin, their religion, to cause them to turn against the fiber of America. I saw one article that said that we've gone from Norman Rockwell's America to Hugh Hefner's America. And that is very much we are seeing that happen. I implore you, wherever you are, if you have any ability to remove this woke Marxist agenda from our schools, I implore you to do that. You will be called a bigot. You will have people after you who hate you. I have that against me. I've had strange packages arrive at my house. I've had people attempt to hack into my Apple ID. I have strange things happening on a fairly regular basis. And, but it's worth it for me to put up with that, because what's the alternative? I'm just going to sit back and watch my society go to pot. Maybe it's going to go to pot, but not if I can do anything about it. So please, please educate yourself further. You can grab my book, Beneath Sheep's Clothing, from Amazon or beneathsheepsclothing.org, .com. And I go into these agendas in much more detail. I highly recommend the YouTube channel New Discourses. I'm sorry if you're hearing loud kids in the background. New Discourses with James Lindsay. He's an academic who has delved into the woke academic literature, and he decodes it. It is very academic, but it's very thorough and amazing information. And we're so grateful. I am so grateful for him and all of his work to bring all this information out. And those are two resources I can recommend. Please do what you can. I thank you. And I hope to record some more videos in the future. Thanks so much.